November 24, 2001 at Berlin International Airport. A small aircraft manufactured by the pilot was getting ready for a short night flight. Flight X-3579 with a route from Berlin, Germany to Zurich, Switzerland, covering a distance of 700 km and estimated to take about 1 hour to complete, was on the schedule. The captain, Mr. Han Ultrich Nude, age 57, had accumulated 19,500 flight hours, including 1,700 hours on the Pace 146. Despite being one of the most experienced pilots at Cross, the captain's flying skills were rather lacking. He had failed the transition exam several times. When he did pass the beige 146 pilot license exam, he achieved only average to below average scores. The first officer, Mr. Stephen Laurer, 25 years old, had just 490 flight hours under his belt, with 92 hours on the Bay 146. He had recently graduated as a new pilot and joined Cross at the beginning of 2001. Overall, he had limited experience flying aircraft. The flight consisted of a total of 33 people, including 28 passengers and 5 crew members. The aircraft used for this flight was the British Aerospace 146, registered as Bixham. This is a fairly common aircraft in Europe. The aircraft had been in operation for 5 years, accumulating about 13,000 flight hours. Over 40 minutes after takeoff, Flight Lex 3579 was cruising smoothly at an altitude of 27,000 feet. Preparations for landing were in progress. At this point, the flight crew received unfavorable weather information from the air traffic control tower, stating that the weather at the destination airport was deteriorating. Low clouds near the ground were reducing visibility. Passengers were instructed to fasten their seatbelts in preparation for descending. On board, there were some well-known European artists on their way to Zurich for a performance. The flight crew began using the provided cross-flight documents to approach the selected runway 14 for landing. At the Zurich Airport's air traffic control tower that night, there were 2 individuals, including a trainee and an experienced manager. However, for reasons unknown, the experienced manager left, leaving all remaining tasks to the trainee who had limited experience. Despite the unfavorable weather, the conditions were still within the limits for landing. The captain made a call to inquire about previous landings, and they were reminded to pay close attention to altitude control due to the presence of thick, low-level clouds. Zurich Airport has 3 runways, with the first runway being 1634, primarily used for takeoffs. The second runway is 1432, which is commonly used for landings. Lufthansa 597 also chose the runway 14 threshold for their approach to the airport. The third runway is 28 T-Chat, and it is rarely used. It's only reserved for special cases. As they started their descent and approached the airport, the first officer requested the captain to circle for a bit to wait for the clouds to dissipate. However, the captain believed it was unnecessary, especially since other planes were still landing. As the aircraft was beginning to align with runway 14, as originally planned, they received a request from air traffic control to change the landing runway. It instructed flight LX-3597 to switch from runway 14 to runway 28. Runway 28 was also the least used runway at the airport, and none of the crew members had ever landed on it before. The captain immediately became agitated with ATM. Both of them started arguing, which escalated the tension on board. In Switzerland, the government aims to ensure that people living around the airport have a peaceful night's sleep. Therefore, all flights landing after 10 p.m. were required to use runway 28. ATSI remained firm and didn't change the landing runway for LX-3597. The air traffic controller insisted that they were following the law, but in reality, he was still a trainee, so there were some aspects he didn't fully grasp. Runway 28 also lacked the instrument landing system as weight, which meant that pilots had to rely on older technology called non-directional beacon navigation. The computer would guide the pilots to various radio beacons, and the routes from these beacons would lead them to the runway. One drawback of this technology was that it only helped pilots find their way to the airport, but didn't provide information on the required altitude to maintain. Pilots had to manually calculate the altitude, and this method of approach and navigation had caused the captain to fail not just one, but many tests in the past. This was indeed his weakness. As they proceeded, flight LX-3597 began its landing process in thick, dense clouds. Starting at the altitude while not being able to see the runway lights was incredibly challenging. Therefore, once again, the first officer suggested aborting the landing and circling back. However, the captain continued the descent because he believed he could see the lights on the national road on the ground. The aircraft continued to descend in silence. The weather deteriorated further, but no sudden decision to abort the landing was made. Terrain collision warning sounded, leaving both pilots in shock.
Terrain, pull up, terrain, pull up.
Flight LX-3597 struck a hill near Zurich Airport. The aircraft broke into several pieces and caught fire. Out of the 33 people on board, 24 lost their lives, while 9 survived by sitting in the tail section of the aircraft, which had separated before the plane exploded. The Swiss National Transportation Safety Board conducted an investigation into the accident. The 3957 crash was a series of errors, ranging from the airline pilots and ATSI to the navigational chart the crew used, which lacked a mountain symbol on the approach route. Combined with the fog, it led the crew into danger without their awareness. Indeed, after 10 p.m., all planes were required to land on runway 28. However, in bad weather, this runway was not used, meaning that planes were obliged to land on runway 14 as usual. Due to being a trainee, ATSI was unaware of this requirement, and his supervisor was absent. The pilots made an error by failing to make the necessary decision to ensure flight safety. The captain, with poor skills, descended too quickly during the approach. The airline did not provide any reasons for why a pilot with more go-arounds than landings was allowed to continue operating. Less than a year after the incident, the airline declared bankruptcy. The trainee supervisor was terminated and received a 6-month prison sentence for gross negligence, leading to serious consequences.